Welcome back, everyone. This is J-Face Games. It's been a little while. We're going to get back where we left off. So what I'm looking at are, currently we're exploring board games and the mechanics in board games and how we can borrow those and use those board game mechanics to play in an RPG system. All right, so the first one I want to talk about today, and you can see I'm trying a new color scheme over here. We're trying the dark mode now. The first one I'm going to talk about today is super simple. It's called Crystal Clans. This was a card game board game that was, let me pull it up. This game was a card game board game by Plaid Hat Games. In essence, it was their sort of, not sequel to Summoner Wars, because there actually is a sequel now, but it was sort of a, in the same vein as Summoner Wars. You had a deck of cards. That deck of card was represented by a theme, and those were your actual soldiers and units, and you were going against someone else, right? So here is in essence sort of how the game looks. Very territorial, moving cards, etc. What was a really cool mechanic I loved in this game was this right here. You had this track. There was a resource track. And in essence, on your turn, different things cost different amount of resources. To move cost a certain amount of resources. To play a card cost a certain amount of resources, etc. But what would happen is you could see that this track represents, on one half is your resources, on the other half is the other player's resources. And so you take your turn until that resource coin goes over to the other person's side. Once it crosses 0, now it's that player's turn, and they use whatever resources they have. So what's really interesting in this game is that there's sort of a pressure luck mechanic where you could get the resources down to 1, and then you could play a unit that cost 8 resources. But the problem is it would push it 8 spots, or roughly the mathematical equivalent. So then it would go to 7 resources for them. Okay? And so there's this really cool balancing act. Once again, to push your luck in a way, there's a really cool balancing act where what I'm doing is I'm trying to move my units and make a big push, but I have to be aware that if I make too big of a push and I'm not successful, or I don't do what I wanted to do, I might be giving you a truck ton of resources then on your turn that you can play with all of those resources, and by the end of it, still not give me much to use on my turn. So I really like this concept, and it makes me wonder about things like stunt points in RPG systems, or even when you think about D&D and you think about like the fighter battle master class and how he has his battle master superiority dice and those sort of things. But what if this was representative of a resource, a pool of some sort that the players had and the DM had as access to as well? And it was this sort of same thing where you could build up some resources as players and spend those, but if you could spend more than you have technically, but you're actually giving the DM more. It's kind of similar to, you could kind of equate it to Fate, and how Fate Core has their Fate tokens, and how those Fate tokens go both ways. Those Fate tokens can be spent, but then when they're spent and used on an enemy, they go to that enemy, etc. But I think that Fate system's a little bit still high-level conceptual, and so this game is much more down in the trenches, that you actually power specific abilities, i.e. these cards, with this resources. So you could probably do something similar, where maybe it's I use some resources to block, or maybe I use some resources to riposte the enemy, or whatever the case might be. But by doing that, I'm actually giving the DM a little bit of resources. The other idea might be that maybe there's resources if you want to make it less about empowering the DM and, oh, I don't want to do this because now I'm giving the DM stuff. Maybe you make it so that there's a resource pool that's common amongst the players, but when you spend it as a player, you then are spending it and pushing it towards someone else, right? You have to use it, and when you use it, it then goes to someone else's pool. And so now you're looking at teamwork, team synergy. I do a shield block, I defend for my friend, I then give them some resources representing that they now have an opening or something along those lines. And so maybe you have a common pool amongst the players, and that pool is what generates their abilities, and they have to figure out how to use it and spend it and flow it around the table. right? So then you could have everyone's just every turn they're taking basic actions, and when they take a basic action, it just goes to someone else, and then someone else has to give them a resource. But that would be very, if they decide to do that so that every turn everyone's doing a very basic stuff, great, but then there's no big swings, no big hits. And if there's anything we've learned about, especially in 5e D&D, spike damage is king. And if you can burn someone down, the more attacks you get, the more spike damage you can get, the faster you can eliminate the enemy. And then that's when you start to come up with combos. I like the idea of, if you've ever played Lord of the Rings online RPG, that was a cool co-op RPG, massively multiplayer online game that had combos. It had that I'm going to do an opening and then you do this and you do this. You see that in the Marvel movies when it's the Avengers and they're getting together, they have their, combinations that they're able to power together. And I think that if you have some sort of pool system like this, then you might have something really interesting. I think that it's worth noting that there was a video that was released this week also. I was thinking about this idea previously, but then Matt Colville came out with a video this week on Kingdoms and Warfare, and he talks about organizations and how organizations have a pool of resources that the players can use. So this is 5e, it's a 5e mod, so you've got all the 5e normal mechanics, it's just an added mechanic built onto it where you as an organization, I think it's like you have X amount of dice that sometime when you're rolling initiative, you can decide to put that dice towards the pool, and those pools are extra, amazing abilities that you can use. So he uses it more as a flavor add-on to add on teamwork. This is the idea of how do you build an RPG around it? How do you build an RPG around that teamwork from the get-go? And maybe it's some sort of shared pool of some sort. I think some RPGs have done this in terms of individual characters, that the individual characters have a pool that they're moving things around, but it hasn't been extrapolated out to the party. And then the question becomes, does it change or break the game in terms of how many members in the party you have, etc.? Does that mean you have more resources? That's for another day, another DM to figure out the problem with. But I like this idea, and this is Crystal Clans. Hopefully you guys subscribe, hit the bell, and please leave comments about ideas you guys have, because I'd love to know what sort of stuff is brewing in your heads.